The life and intellectual labor of Alain Locke constitutes one of the most sophisticated, persistent, and uncompromising defenses of Black autonomy in the history of the U.S. Born in 1885 into the rarefied, highly educated strata of Philadelphia's Black elite, Locke's trajectory was governed by a constant, high stakes navigation and negotiation between his immense academic privilege and the visceral, soul crushing realities of a society defined by Jim Crow. From his earliest days, Locke carried a heavy, multifaceted burden. The profound loss of his father when he was only 6 years old, and a lifelong chronic heart condition that restricted him from the physical rough and tumble of boyhood, forcing him to seek refuge in the vast, boundless world of the mind. Yet, it was precisely these deep seated constraints, the physical frailty, the diminutive stature, and the increasingly acute, guarded awareness of his own queer identity that catalyzed his maturation into a master of interior life. While his political contemporaries were busy fighting for legal access in the streets, Locke perceived something more fundamental, that the entire architecture of white supremacy was built upon a psychological foundation of dehumanization that had to be dismantled from within. He understood perhaps more clearly than anyone else in his generation that before a people could demand legal equality, they had to define their own humanity, reclaiming the absolute non negotiable right to interpret their own history, art, and aesthetic values without feeling the permission, patronage, or validation of a hostile supremacist majority.
Locke's academic pedigree, while undeniably unparalleled, was a path continuously obstructed by the same virulent bigotry that shaped the nation's social landscape. When he achieved the historic milestone of becoming the first African American Rhodes Scholar in 1907, the University of Oxford became the crucible of his intellectual evolution and his radicalization. Upon his arrival in England, he was not met with the collegial welcome afforded to his peers. Instead, he was confronted by the open, vitriolic racism of his fellow American scholars, men who actively lobbied to exclude him from collective social functions and demanded he be barred from their company. This systematic humiliation served as a profound, life altering epiphany. Locke realized that the national ideal of the American melting pot was nothing more than a hollow, dangerous myth, a deliberate tool used to erase minority identities and subsume them into a white centered hegemony. In the wake of this realization, he began to craft his seminal philosophy of cultural pluralism. His subsequent studies in Europe, in particular, his rigorous engagement with the Austrian school of value theory, and his participation in the Universal Races Congress of 1911 provided him a radical framework. Race was not a static, biological destiny, but a malleable social and historical construct. This shift allowed Locke to argue that being Black was a shared, profound experience, one that could be meticulously organized, curated, and leveraged into a new, modern destiny that transcended the suffocating limitations of the Jim Crow South.
Returning to Howard University, Locke sought to operationalize this vision, attempting to convert the philosophy department into a sophisticated laboratory for Black studies, aesthetics, and avant garde drama. His tenure, however, was unending, grueling battlefield. He spent years fighting against a conservative, sycophantic board of trustees and an administration that viewed Black literature as mere political propaganda and African American history as a volatile, unacceptable threat to their own administrative control. Locke's scandalous, politically motivated dismissal in 1925, coming immediately on the heels of his curation of the landmark Survey graphic issue, was a calculated attempt by the university to silence a man who refused to treat black education as a subservient second class footnote to the Western tradition. Yet this institutional exile proved to be only a temporary tactical retreat. Locke's vision was already taking root in the fertile soil of Harlem, where the new Negro was beginning to shed the old Negro mask of submissive mimicry, replacing it with a self conscious, vibrant, and unapologetic agency that would irreversibly shift the trajectory of American culture.
The 1925 publication of The New Negro, an interpretation, was far more than a book. It was a manifesto for psychological and spiritual emancipation. Locke's editorial strategy, which he frequently described as civil rights by copyright, was an ambitious attempt to force the broader world to reckon with black brilliance on its own terms. He was a meticulous, often interventionist curator, famously altering the cadence of poetry and omitting lines from major artists like Countee Cullen to ensure that the published work projected a vision of assertive African heritage rather than internal conflict, doubt, or submission. This was Locke's greatest gift and his most fiercely criticized attribute. He operated under the conviction that Black art had to be disciplined, elevated, and rigorously curated to command the respect of a world that refused to look at Black life with anything but prejudice, that is. He viewed the spirituals, the evolving, complex sounds of jazz, and the authentic folk traditions of the South, not as primitive remnants of a past to be escaped, but as the most original, modern, and essential contributions to the American artistic canon.
The ideological chasm between Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois regarding the art or propaganda debate remains one of the most significant, bitter, and defining intellectual divides in the history of Black thought. Du Bois, ever the political warrior, believed that all art should serve the cause of social uplift, utilizing the image of the talented tenth to prove Black moral rectitude to a skeptical, racist white public. Locke disagreed fundamentally and systemically. He argued that the moment an artist begins to collaborate their work to satisfy the white gaze, the moment they begin to plead, posture, or cater to white expectations, they have already accepted a position of subordination. For Locke, the artist's only duty was to be honest, to plumb the depths of the Black experience, and to create beauty without a defensive justification. He held that genuine, high quality art would inherently command its own dignity, whereas propaganda would only ever function as a desperate, extroverted plea for recognition that ultimately reinforced the very inferiority it sought to deny.
Locke's private life was a necessary, hidden, and precarious geometry of survival. He lived in the shadows as a gay man in an era of intense, suffocating Victorian homophobia, cultivating a secret, protective network for the young Black artists he mentored. This was a world of private salons, coded communication, and deep, often tragic, emotional bonds, carefully shielded from the harsh judgment of the very church and political establishment he was simultaneously challenging in his academic work. This network, however, was tethered to the capricious and often manipulative patronage of wealthy white donors like Charlotte Osgood Mason, who sought to commodify the primitive essence of his proteges. Locke, caught in the middle of these demands, often found himself in the agonizing position of an intermediary trying to protect the integrity of artists like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, while satisfying the paternalistic whims of those who provided the funds that made their work possible.
His spiritual commitment to the Baha'i faith provided the ultimate overarching framework for his life and philosophy. The religion's core tenets of racial unity and the spiritual interconnectedness of all people mirrored his own axiological research and his driving desire for a globalized democracy. Locke's contribution to the faith, including his painstaking editorial work on Shoghi Effendi's translations, grounded his intellectual projects in a sense of universal purpose. He moved well past the local American dilemma, viewing the struggle for racial justice as a necessary prerequisite for a broader, global world order. His philosophy was never intended to be a regional project. It was an ambitious attempt to envision a humanity that could be united through the celebration of cultural diversity, rather than through the forced, violent assimilation of dominant cultures into a singular, sterile identity.
The later years of Locke's life were met with the harsh, biting winds of historical revisionism. The rise of urban realism, spearheaded by figures like Richard Wright, marked a move away from Locke's aestheticism toward a focus on the brutal, material realities of class and economic exploitation. Later, Harold Cruse would attack Locke's entire project in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, making an argument that Locke's movement was politically naive for its reliance on white capital and its failure to build the institutional power necessary to control Black culture. While these critiques were essential for understanding the limitations of the Harlem Renaissance, they often overlooked the sheer, quiet bravery of Locke's refusal to accept the script of the victim. Locke did not just survive in a hostile landscape, he curated an entire world of intellectual possibility for those who had been told they were invisible and insignificant.
Ultimately, Alain Locke's legacy is not found in the tedious academic debates over whether his approach was enough or whether his methods were too elitist for the masses. His legacy is found in his profound, unyielding refusal to let the state, the institution, or the racist majority define the parameters of black existence. He was a man who lived his entire life in the margins. As a black intellectual, as a queer man, and as a person struggling with chronic debilitating illness. And he transformed those margins into the center of a monumental cultural renaissance. He taught a generation to stop begging for entry and to start building their own foundations. We look at his life today and we see the essential blueprint for what it means to remain intellectually free in a world that is designed to limit your vision. His power remains a testament to the idea that true power starts with the ability to value oneself when no one else will. It is a stark, necessary reminder that we are all responsible for the spaces we hold for one another and the culture we choose to foster in the face of immense crushing pressure. We look back, we learn, and we move forward with the understanding that our community is our greatest resource and our self determination is our greatest weapon. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.